You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to First Contact, playing you none of the hits, all of the time. I'm Andrew.
I'm James.
And I'm Alex.
This quarter, we have been watching The Offspring. It first aired the week of March 12th, 1990. It was written by Rennie Echevarria and directed by, Jonathan Frakes. How interesting. James, what doth happen in this one?
On returning from a cybernetics conference, Data decides to lock himself away in his lab. Despite Wesley's lurking, he won't tell anyone what he's working on. Turns out he's been building himself a new android, one that he considers his child. He allows Lal to pick a gender and appearance, and they settle on becoming a human female. She begins to learn and develop, in some ways exceeding Data. But when Admiral Badguy discovers her existence, he wants to take her away to Starfleet, arguing that Data is ill-equipped to mentor a new android. Will Starfleet get their way? Will Data be able to exercise the rights he won last season? Or will tragedy mean the starring guest performer only appears once?
Well, Alex, you've never seen this episode before, so the format dictates. What did you think of this one?
It's pretty good, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty inconsequential as well, or it would seem to be, and it kind of feels like Measure of a Man 2, Electric Boogaloo. But
that really works. That's an excellent gag.
But yeah, I mean, you know, it plays to those feelings that everyone, or no, that's unfair, that a lot of people will have at some point about continuing your line, or even, you know, just getting bored during a conference and sneaking off back to a room to produce something from your robo seed.
I think it's a little bit unfair to describe it as just a sequel to Measure of a Man, because I think Measure of a Man is about the rights of the individual, and this is more about the rights of a race.
I wouldn't call it a sequel. I would say it's perhaps born of the same mould, which is also coincidentally how Lal is produced, from a mould. A really bloody creepy mould. No, I mean, you know, presumably he could have made that face into anything, really, because there's nothing to say that he's using, you know, pre-made parts, and if he is, what sort of horror shop is he getting them from? So why would you choose to make it like that? I mean, I didn't assume that Lal was being commissioned by Data to have her face constructed by the woman from the video for Hello.
I thought it was more like that painting of Jesus. For anyone who doesn't know, women in a church tried to restore a fresco. Unfortunately, that woman was blind. Yeah, it's kind of a weird, kind of like a giant drumming monkey or something. It's a very odd facial construction, but I guess the idea is that this is just the most basic humanoid form that can then be moulded into anything.
They just didn't want her to look human, basically.
Or have any mouth articulation.
Can we start right at the start of the episode? I just want to mention one thing. Now, obviously, Jonathan Frakes is directing, but Commander Riker is on personal leave. And I don't know, I just thought, he's had to go to an STD clinic, hasn't he?
The minute they said that, you instantly know what's going on behind the scenes. You don't you really? It's like watching an old 60s Doctor Who. And the Doctor's been captured and doesn't appear for the rest of the episode because William Hartnell's gone off to the Bahamas for the week. Actually, that's perhaps a little extravagant. William Hartnell's gone to Skegness for the week.
William Hartnell has had to sit down. Yeah. They didn't really need to mention it, because he is in one scene, albeit in a sort of cameo. And you didn't miss him in the scenes that he might have been in otherwise. He wasn't integral to the plot, so you might as well not have mentioned it at all, to be perfectly honest. His shuttle's arrived. Okay, why did that need to be there in any way whatsoever?
I think the idea was so you could build up to the moment where Riker walks in and he has no idea about Lal.
To be fair, that is a pretty good gag. So
it is, until you start thinking through the elements of it, that essentially, to most people on board the ship, Lal is considered a child, mentally a child. And then Riker turns up and Captain Saville comes along to start chatting up the woman on the bar with the mentality of a child.
He didn't chat her up, to be fair.
He was trying to. He didn't whack out the old chap on the counter, but, you know.
His usual technique. So let's get back to the appearances then, because I love the scene in the holodeck. I mean, this episode, actually, they did play up the comedy quite a bit, enough for it to be natural. There's quite a lot of absurd moments in it, because I think this is actually quite an affecting episode. It's quite emotionally truthful. But the scene in the holodeck, with down to the 4 options, apparently there's thousands to start with, she narrows it down to 4. The human male, the human female, the Andorian, and the Klingon male. And I just think what a joy the episode would have been if she just decided to be a Klingon.
And Troy's one comment on the human female, I like her. That's all she had to say. She had this massive diatribe for the Andorian, the Klingon, the human male, but for the human female, it's I like her.
I suppose in some ways we can be glad that they didn't decide just to make it Brent Spiner acting like a child. How terrible that would be. Imagine if they tried to do that at any point. Because anytime there's an android, they're like, hey, Brent will do this. It's so nice to actually have a different performance, although a very fine actor, Brent Spiner. I think it's nice to actually have an actual other character.
I think in many ways, we could talk about this episode as having a lot of comedy, and really it pushes that more than anything, as well as the emotional impact. But I felt watching it was the first time I realised that this is the first time, aside from maybe Measure of a Man, in which Star Trek The Next Generation has tackled social issues that are relevant to when Next Generation was airing. In fact, still relevant today. You know, in the same way that the original series tackled social issues. You know, and when the original series tackled social issues, it was a lot more black and white.
Literally,
with the episode where the aliens were one half black, one half white.
Can I remind you of Code of Honor?
But that's the thing. The first 2 seasons of Next Generation, it was tackling social issues very badly as well, in the same way that you would in the original series. And you can't do that in the late 80s, early 90s. This is the first episode that is a lot more subtle, and actually, in many ways, it's tackling issues that were not even as relevant in 1990 when this aired. You could argue that it talks about, you know, you've got Lal choosing her gender, choosing, you know, defining her identity, and that's an issue that is still a massive social issue today.
And that's not even what the episode's about, but it's very much an undercurrent in those early scenes, and I'd sort of forgotten about that, or certainly watching it again, that has so much more impact, I think, watching it today than certainly it did when I watched it 10 or 20 years ago. And I think if you did overplay that, you know, it might actually engulf the story, but it's there and very progressive, but it doesn't become what the episode is about. But certainly, it's good to see that Star Trek was as progressive as its reputation suggests, and not as perhaps backwards as some people might perceive it to be.
I mean, the way some issues within this episode, they actually wanted to take it a little bit further. Well, I say take it further. They wanted to show two men holding hands in 10 forward, but there was a producer, and I'll just get his name. Yeah. So it was the producer David Livingston came down to make sure that we didn't see a same-sex couple holding hands in 10 forward.
Do we now have to create another voice for another producer?
Actually, Star Trek has got a very poor track record in representation. That's going to change if Discovery ever gets made. But in terms of LBGT representation, it's very much not good. And actually having a couple holding hands would be the worst kind of tokenistic gesture. Sure, it'd be nice that it's there and acknowledged, but a little bit weak. And the fact that it didn't happen is perhaps even weaker. But hey, let's get back to what's good.
Yes, let's talk about the weird room that Lal is constructed in. What room is that supposed to be?
It's Data's lab. He's had a lab the whole time. It's
Right, why does he have a lab? And I'll get to the nub of the issue. Why has it got a big lift in the middle of the room to go and hide your abomination in the ceiling?
I can only assume that this chamber was created so that they could repair Data, and when the little lift goes up, that's the android equivalent of a CAT scan.
I think it might be a sort of Frankenstein reference. Maybe it feels a bit like that to me, especially the scene with him holding the foot. Which is just a little grim.
Yeah. I mean, there's a wonderful mashup to be done somewhere in there where you just paint out all of the robotic parts. And when Picard and the rest of the crew actually come into the room, what they discover is actually more reminiscent of that scene where Bill Paxton enters the room in Lost Highway and discovers his girlfriend mutilated on the floor.
Do you know what I like about this episode? It's got a montage in it with all Lal's early experiences. I love a montage, and Star Trek does not do enough montage. And actually, just purely as a language of film exercise, I feel they cram a lot into this episode. Because actually, you have... what's her name? You have Hallie Todd as Lal. Actually, you only really see her for, 30 minutes of the episode, and I think they really do manage to create a character that works and sticks in your mind and that you care about in that short space of time. So if we need to montage, let us montage.
It's the first episode to present GIF-worthy material, that isn't unintentionally funny.
Shall we talk a bit about Picard in this episode? Because to me, he seems, I don't know, a little bit season 1 Picard, perhaps, a little impatient, a little quick to anger. And I can understand it, because this creation has massive consequences. This is a very big deal. But he's sort of not really expressing his reservations in the right way. It's just, Mr. Data, you had to ask my permission to make the android lady. I don't know. He seems very abrupt.
He's trying to understand it himself. So he, as a character, doesn't quite understand fully the situation yet. And I think by the end of the episode, he realises that it is a child just as we would treat any child in many ways. And that's why I think that it's one of my favourite Picard moments in all of Star Trek, when we see him stand firm and tell Data, no, we're not going to give Lal to the Admiral. That's one of the bravest moments in the show. We've had him taken hostage and be in firefights, but it's him standing up to this Admiral, putting his career at risk. That, I think, is so fitting within his character. It is the bravest moment for Picard.
Yeah, no, I'd go with that. I mean, you could, I suppose, argue that Picard more than Data has the biggest arc in this episode. Data's arc really is Data creates Thing, Data realises Thing is overtaking him in brilliance, Thing dies, Data sad. Whereas Picard, you're right, goes from being on the defensive to, well, in theory, should be pushing the plot forwards, but the plot just sort of judders at that point. But, we'll get to that.
You can draw the parallel to Measure of a Man here, because that's also remembered as a Data episode, but actually it's just a Patrick Stewart tour de force. And I think you get that here as well. And I think perhaps deliberately so, he's so much on the defensive early on that you do get him to go through this arc, and you do get him to be that great defender of rights, the most liberal lawmaker, the person who understands the importance of duty, but also to recognise the rights of individuals. And I suppose it feels a lot like, although Starfleet defined the rights, that Data is a life form in the Measure of a Man. It feels like Starfleet regards that as a piece of bureaucracy that they can just ignore because they've got a new toy that they want to play with.
On a side note to that, though, and, respecting a robotic individual's rights, I don't mean to go all sort of nitpicker's guide here, but sod it, I'm going to anyway. Hasn't Data previously talked about if you had an off switch, you wouldn't want people to know where it was? But he was quite happy to use it here.
Yeah, I think that's a fun kind of comedy moment in some ways. It's him almost having the mirror held up to him with the non-stop talking, and it's a parenting gag as well. Wouldn't you love to turn your child off?
I can turn your baby off.
It's the human equivalent of putting a dummy into the baby, I think.
I don't think we can read too much into that, or we will be going a bit nitpicker's guide, and then we'll have to stop doing the podcast because no one will want to listen, nor will they want to talk to us.
But they might buy our book for a penny on Amazon.
This episode sort of ambles along quite nicely. It's someone discovering themselves, discovering what they know, learning to interact with the world, seeing their limitations, and then you kind of feel we have to have a plot. We have to have something threatening this. We have to have a bit of a countdown. So they introduce the character of Admiral Halftel, because all Starfleet admirals are terrible, terrible people. They just promote the people who they don't want to be captains because they're somehow sinister to be admirals, and they all have some kind of slightly scary agenda going on. What do you think of this character? It's a bit broad for me, I think.
Forgettable. I would say one note until his last scene, and his last scene is odd to me. I get why his last scene is him coming around from having seen Data work, and he's quite moved by it. But the old adage of show don't tell. I don't know. It felt like it had gone awry there somewhat.
I think it feels like there's a scene missing. And actually, I feel like that at the end of the episode. I think it does go very, very suddenly. However, I will confess to being an absolute blubbering wreck watching this. Like, it just completely set me off. I'm not quite sure why, but it did produce the emotional response desired, and I was completely gone. So, if I can come around with absolutely no heart and no soul, then I can understand why Admiral Badguy can become Admiral Empathetic.
The most disappointing of all admirals.
I think there's quite nice use of the supporting cast in this episode. I quite like the sort of crushers used here. I just a little bit of mentoring with Beverly Crusher, the one mother on the ship, apparently, the one that we know, and her saying, I wasn't always the most popular person, and you think, you, Beverly? Surely not. Life and soul of the party? I can't imagine anyone not liking you. I think that's nice. I think the scene with Wesley being a teenager, parents,
That is the worst line in all of Star Trek. That is, I've noted that down. Parents, nothing personal. That is absolutely atrocious.
I don't know. I also thought Wesley, aren't you supposed to be getting a haircut? Was quite bad.
It's fine.
His hair's fine. It's not that long. What's he going to get? A crew cut?
They are fulfilling their function as characters. They might be a bit one note, but they are being used here with a purpose. Even Troy, who sort of seems to be just bemused by everything, and it's just like, this is a bit of a laugh, isn't it? And I actually quite like Troy having that kind of being a bit of a detached arsehole. It's more interesting, certainly, than her just noticing things and feeling things. So, yeah, I think this is, they use the supporting cast in a supporting way, in a supporting, appropriate way.
I do kind of feel that for as much as I like the central performance, that one of the things that maybe hampers the episode a little bit is that it seems to me like you can have a very clear 3-act divide down it. The whole start of it, where it's perhaps really playing on that sort of Measure of Man type of thing, with the construction and should he have created Lal? Then you've got that 3rd act where everything sort of speedily comes to a conclusion, and we have our sentimental moment. And then, the middle, where you have all of the light-hearted stuff, not being able to drink, or her not being able to catch a ball, or her being isolated by a group of children and laughed at.
They were not laughing with her, they were laughing at her.
I feel as Star Trek fans we can all identify with that. Well, I think there's also perhaps you could if you wanted to read that as almost Star Trek's version of an autistic child, someone who isn't able to interact with other children in the way that they would like to. That there's something that makes them different. The way they process the world is different, and there are social limitations. And again, that's interesting. There's a lot of depth underneath the very interesting surface of this episode.
Did they take Lal to the puppy room?
I hope so. I mean, that would have been a lovely scene, wouldn't it? Would you like to take it to the warp core, Lal? Chuck it in. Go on. Actually, if you think about that was the child, wasn't it? That we had the puppy room, and this is another version of that. One of the crew has a child, and what is the impact of that? And just look how much this show has grown.
To the point that at one point, Troy says to Picard, "You clearly aren't a parent," or something along those lines. And you just think, yeah, but you barely were. Let's be honest. I mean, I've spent a modicum of time in France. I wouldn't consider myself French. Apparently it works for Captain Picard, but I do feel that, though, it's the middle section of this episode where it works best, where you have the balance of those lighter moments and that montage, as you say, with the social analysis. It gets the balance right here whereas at the end it tips its hand a bit. Though, perfectly justifiable that at the end you can deal more in the sentiment. My issue is that it just sort of crashes out of this middle section that's moving along comfortably, and it just crashes to a reasonably abrupt end. Especially as it had sort of slowed its pace a little bit prior to that with her going to work in the bar. Which is an interesting reaction. We can't put her in a school. Put her to work in the bar.
I think that's all to kind of shoehorn Guinan into the episode. And I don't know how much she adds. I mean, yeah, she is this great wise observer of human behaviour, and I suppose it's someone outside that command structure that you can have these interactions with.
Now, Picard takes the Admiral down there and tries to, say about how trusted a member of the crew that Guinan is, and, one of the safest pairs of hands on board the ship. If you took your boss down to the pub and introduced them to the landlord and said, the temp is in safe hands here, I'm not sure that'd wash.
They don't serve alcohol in 10 Forward, it's all synthahol.
I hate synthahol. Synthahol's the worst Star Trek invention ever. It's just ridiculous. It's the most kind of stupid fantasy-esque element of Star Trek. It's like, you feel drunk as long as you want to. What? Shut up.
I know what you mean. I don't like synthahol. I'm not a fan of 80s music either. Although it's 80s, so that should be an electronic drum beat. At no point during that bar scene, at no point, when Lal is just stood looking over the couples, at no point does anyone have the natural reaction of turning around and going, "You got a problem here, pal."
The ending, I think, seems a little bit abrupt, but do you think it was necessary for this character just to be a one-shot for them to have to die? I mean, very good performance, very interesting. I think fertile ground to explore, a slightly different angle on ideas we've seen before. But do you think it was sort of necessary for her to die? She couldn't just go into the background, be recurring, or go off to Starfleet or anything. It is just, to have the impact, it has to be that absolutely brutal ending.
I think if she goes off to Starfleet, it sends out the wrong message. They want Starfleet in the future to be all shiny and nice. And if Starfleet are on the wrong side of the debate and they win, then that sends completely the wrong message about this perfect utopian future. So the only alternative was she would remain on board ship and be a recurring character, which I'd have no problem with. If she replaced Wesley, for example, that would have been preferable, to be honest.
I think because of the way they set it up in the plot, they kind of force themselves into a corner here. The minute that she starts to overtake Data, you kind of have to kill the character off, because you're creating someone who's still constantly learning and is outdoing what is supposed to be the super genius. You've written yourself into a corner. You kind of have to get rid of that character. In a way, I kind of prefer that they do, to be honest, because especially when a character just fades into the background, it's yeah, I feel it's better to get rid of the character. I'm glad that they didn't go quite as sentimental as they could have done with it. I'll be honest, what I was expecting was to have a scene with why do people die, Daddy? In a sort of recreation of that horrific kids' TV programme. Can you remember that? I can't remember which one it is. The one where the animal's dead and all the puppets are discussing why do people die?
It was Pipkins.
It is Pipkins, yes.
The sort of slightly grubby version of the Muppets, I guess. A kind of Sesame Street for the UK.
And my God, it was grubby. It looked like they pulled all of the puppets out of a bin. But that's where I was expecting it to go. And then instead we get a scene where the Admiral comes out and his hands moved so fast. I realise this sounds like the start of an erotic novel, but actually I'm very sad. That's where I expected it was going to go. That is genuinely where I expected it was going to go. And instead we're presented with that odd scene. And again, show don't tell, I think. It felt a weird way to do it to me. And then you still have the scene afterwards. But I kind of feel that it had less of an impact than it could have done. I don't know. I just felt that they fumbled at the end there. Whereas it would have had a better effect if, say, the Admiral had come out and everyone says what's going on, and the Admiral just sort of ushers them into the room and sees Data looking over sad or some such.
I feel like, as well, obviously she was developing very quickly, but there is the whole element of this Admiral comes in and creates a very stressful situation, and in some ways is the instigator of that development of these really intense emotions. So basically, he murders her, and we don't actually have any ramifications of that really either.
I think we should consider it manslaughter rather than murder.
Okay, well, let's define it that way. But at the end, he's all, Data was working so hard, I understand now. And you sort of want to... No, you are the bad guy. You caused a really terrible thing to happen. And that's not really dealt with. It's just like, well, Data, take your station. Come on, get on with it.
But would that always have happened? Would that level of stress always have been an inevitability, or was it particularly high because of the situation? Because it's a high stress level, but I would argue it's not necessarily one that you wouldn't experience through the rest of the course of your life. I'm not saying that, you'd see Lal go into a chip shop and break down entirely over the choice between a battered sausage and a Savoy, but I can just imagine that if the Admiral hadn't caused it, something else would have caused her to go wrong. And I'd have to watch it again. I've obviously only watched it the once. I got the sense that perhaps what Data had been doing to try and expand her memory and her abilities sort of accelerated the possibility for her to go wrong.
Well, anyway, this one made me sad.
And I was very sad at the end as well. I thought it hit the emotional beats very well.
What you're saying, essentially, is that we should treat this episode of First Contact the same way that the episode treats the plot. Were you sad? Yes, I was. Excellent, so moving on.
Let's reconvene in Quickfire!
Quickfire.
So, I think the most important part of the episode, though, is that we get to see Captain Picard in his sexy pyjamas. I think a Jonathan Frakes hallmark there. Always get Patrick Stewart topless.
I want to know what they do with the parts of Lal once she's gone wrong. Do they just put her in a bin, or do they repurpose her? Now, this is entirely influenced by the fact that I watched some old episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine and was reminded that old unused engines do get turned into generators.
That's quite disturbing, isn't it?
It is quite disturbing. And always out the back of the shed so the other engines can't see. Something happened to the Reverend Audrey towards the end of those stories. I mean, there was always a sort of dark streak running through some of them, bricking up Henry in the tunnel, but my God, later down the line, some of it gets dark.
Talking of good lines, since we've mentioned bad ones already, he's biting that female. It's one of my favourite lines in Star Trek. I think that's wonderful.
There was one person who didn't particularly like this episode or think it was a good idea, and surprisingly it was the writer of Measure of a Man, Melinda Snodgrass, who said, "I felt it was fairly obvious and tired and stupid, and I didn't want to do it."
She's going to leave by the end of the season, isn't she?
About halfway through the season, so it was roughly around this time.
Renee Echevarria, this was their first episode. They would go on to work on Star Trek for quite some time, writing for this and Deep Space Nine, which is nice.
Of course, Jonathan Frakes will go on to direct more Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and a couple of Star Trek films.
And now he works regularly directing The Librarians, the spin-off TV show from the Librarian TV movies, which he also directed.
I've never heard of The Librarians.
And according to Star Trek's 365, Jonathan Frakes decided to direct the episode because he was tired of taking naps.
According to the Star Trek The Next Generation companion, Frakes had been trying to direct for quite some time, but Rick Berman told him he'd have to go to directing school before directing the show. He spent over 300 hours. Like, did he really? That seems like, who would log that? Observing editors, watching other directors, going to the dubbing stage, attending seminars, and reading. Yeah? I think the producers were hoping I'd lose interest, but I didn't, he once said. So many cast members will go on to direct episodes, including Patrick Stewart, Roxanne Dawson, Robert Duncan McNeil. This is, of course, across all the Star Trek shows, LeVar Burton. But Garrett Wang was not allowed to direct.
I've got a quote from makeup artist Doug Drexler about the gold paint for the first appearance of Lal. Drexler says, "It took about 4.5 hours. Then he faced a long shooting day. Finally, after dark, the crew went home and I started taking him out of the gold makeup. Mike had an early call for the next morning, so it was only me. I started putting makeup remover on his arms and, well, forget it. That makeup was bulletproof. After hours and hours of rubbing, I called Mike and asked..." Sorry. Oh dear. "After hours and hours of rubbing, I called Mike and asked if he could get somebody to open the studio gym, which he did. That's when I got in the shower with Lenny Crowfoot and a loaf of sponge. I scrubbed him down like I was giving my dog a bath. It was, memorable." Drexler adds with a chuckle, "I'd never taken a shower with a man before."
And of course, a video of this is available on the Blu-ray of Season 3.
Thank you once again for downloading. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Next time we'll be talking about Sins of the Father. Yeah, we will. But until then, goodbye.
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 But they might buy our book for a penny on Amazon.
They might buy our book that we'll never get around to writing.
We wrote 3 pages of it.
Look, when we finish this in 2040, when we get through the 7 seasons, then maybe we'll think about a book, okay?
We wrote 3 pages and did a little drawing of Picard.
It's a very good little drawing of Picard. Where was I?